We want to now look at the narratives about the Israelite Exodus and crossing the sea. And I've added the note, myth or reality. And the reason I do that is, as you might have gathered from the earlier quotation from Zai Hawass and from others, that the Exodus is something that increasingly scholars are rejecting as historical fact. In fact, if you go to Wikipedia, which I do not recommend, but if you use Wikipedia, just read what it says there. Modern archaeology has largely discarded, rejected the historicity of the patriarchs and of the Exodus story, with it being reframed as constituting the Israelites' inspiring national myth narrative. Israelites and their culture, according to modern archaeological account, did not overtake the region by force, but instead branched out of the Canaanite peoples and culture through their development of a distinct monolatristic and later monotheistic religion centered on Yahweh, one of the ancient Canaanite deities. Now that might shock you to find out that Yahweh is not a God who appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but a God of the Canaanite origin. But I think it's fair to say that this statement is one that many people in Western academic universities would accept. And this is something I have been, for the past 40, 50 years, trying to fight against in my research and in my writing. Earlier, I gave you a list of areas of research that can help provide some sort of historical sense to the Exodus narratives, and one of them was the geography. In other words, does the story of the Exodus fit the setting of the Exodus? That is, where the story is said to take place. And does it fit the geography that surrounds that setting? Again, you will find scholars, and I've given you the names of one, Bernard Batto, another, Gusta Ahlstrom, who view the narratives of Exodus to have been original myths, not historical stories, but someone then took these myths and turned them into something that looks like history, but they're not really history. You will also find some commentators on Exodus, such as William Johnstone in 1995, who actually says it's a waste of time, it's futile, waste of time to attempt to locate this theological affirmation in geographical detail. In other words, the Bible is only interested in theology, therefore don't waste your time looking at the geography. Now, I agree that Exodus is ultimately interested in theology. That's why we spent the time we did just before lunch looking at the important question, what is God doing? What is God's purpose? What is He trying to accomplish in the Exodus? But where I have a problem is that the geographical record the Bible provides for us is very specific, it's very accurate, and it fits you into a specific period of time. Now, some of you may know about the writings of Tolkien or C.S. Lewis and the wonderful world that they made up. They made up imaginary geography, imaginary lands, imaginary seas, and gave names to locations, and you can look at their maps on the internet. But I do not know of any archaeologists who are going and try to find these locations, because they recognize they were invented in the mind of the writer. These were not places that correspond to the earth we live in. What the Bible describes, on the other hand, seems to be real geography. This is Professor Donald Redford, one of my professors, who rejects the idea of the scholars I just suggested, and he says that this looks like real geography. He says it does not look like mythology, at least on the definition of the latter as a timeless event set in the world of the gods. He says the biblical writer certainly thinks he is writing datable history. Where Professor Redford and I, my professor, disagree, he thinks it's all narratives made up in the 7th century, 500-600 years after the Exodus, and that it doesn't have any relationship to the Exodus narratives. But I agree with him that the biblical writer thinks he's writing datable history, and I think it is datable history. Now, if we look at Exodus 1:11, we've read over this already a little bit, but in the Hebrew Masoretic text, Exodus 1:11, we read about the taskmasters and making bricks and all this, and they built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. The Greek Septuagint says the same thing, but adds Pitho and Ramses and On, which is Heliopolis, Masr Gadida. So this is interesting that you have this addition, if how that is to be understood. But in any event, the important thing is all of these locations, Pithom, Ramesses, On, are known from Egyptian inscriptions. These are not made-up names. They are not creative mythology. Here you can see, once again, the Wadi Tumilat, which is very important in our narrative today. But here, of course, is Heliopolis, or On, of the biblical text. And probably Tel el-Rataba is Pithom, which we'll come back to in a moment. Now, earlier I introduced you to the Anastasia Papyri, and this is number 6. This is a passage we looked at earlier, and I told you we'd come back to it to look at the geography. And remember that the letter we're reading was sent from somewhere in the Wadi Tumilat. And I want to draw your attention to the name of the site, Mashuta. There's a village there called Mashuta, and the archaeological site, Tel el-Mashuta. Now, the Arabic word Mashuta actually preserves a more ancient pharaonic name, which we'll show you in the moment. On Papyrus Anastasia 6, we'll go back and look at this again. This is the man who is writing from the Wadi Tumilat to his officer, commanding officer, probably back in the capital, either Memphis or somewhere else. And he tells them that he just let the Shasu Bedouin of Edom pass by the fortress of Merneptah of Cheku. Cheku is the Egyptian writing that corresponds to the Hebrew Sukkot. And it is from this word that we get the word Mashuta. So Cheku, Sukkot, Mashuta. So the Arabic Mashuta preserves the ancient pharaonic name, and to the pool of Pithom. Pithom means the house or temple of Atum. Again, Atum is the god who gives his name to the Wadi Tumilat. We've already talked about that. So the pool of Pithom of Merneptah, that's the pharaoh, of Cheku, again, in order to revive themselves, to give them water, etc. But we're looking here at the geography. So we have mentioned here Cheku twice and the pool of Pithom. Now this is, again, the map of the Wadi Tumilat area. You can see where Ismailia is today. Timsah, Bahor Timsah. Here is Tel El Maskuta. Here is Tel El Rataba, probably Pithom of this text. And you can see this small lake that would have been there in ancient times. So this is where the officer, probably at a fort here, allows the Bedouin from Edom to pass by and go to water their sheep in this lake. Okay? So we have in this one papyrus then two very important geographical references that are important to the Exodus narrative. Way back in 1906, the British archaeologist Papyri excavated and discovered the remains of two large forts at Tel El Rataba. And you can see the one wall here, and here is a gate and temple, large houses, two series of walls. So you can see there was at least three periods of building walls. And here's the gate. Now, Polish archaeologists began working here in 2007, along with their colleagues from Slovakia, and they have done further work. They re-excavated the gate area, and this is their new plan, but they date this gate to the reign of Ramses III. Here you can see some of the ancient walls that go with the fort, and some of the buildings. This is from a later period. But here is the results of their work for over 10 years. And I'm just mark off the historical periods that they found information at Tel El Ratabi. The second intermediate period, the Hyksos period, they have some remains there, a settlement and a cemetery. The 18th dynasty, remember the 18th dynasty is very long, from 1550 BC all the way down to 1300 BC. So 250 years, but very little is found there from the 18th dynasty. Then there is major rebuilding in the 19th and 20th dynasties. So that would be the period roughly from 1300 down to 1100. So you can see that this place was very active in what we call the Ramesside era. Ramses II, Merneptah, later on Ramses III. So very important defense walls built, secondary walls, fortress, and so on. And the 20th dynasty, that would be the period roughly from about 1200 down to about 1050. Again, you can see in the green. So the best represented period at the site is the period of the late New Kingdom. The early New Kingdom has very little. And the secondary period has something. There was something there if Abraham and Jacob came through this way in the 1700s or thereabouts. So this is very interesting. Now the site continues down all the way into late Roman period and even Ottoman. They found remains from the Ottoman period. So it has a very, very long history. But important to note that during the period of 1300 to about 1100 is when it had the largest building and was most active. Now, locating Ramses has been an interesting exercise. Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, reigned from 1279 to 1213 BC, and he built a new city, a new capital for himself. And Pi-Ramesses or Per-Ramesses means the house or the domain of Ramses. For a long time, scholars have recognized that the term Ramses, that occurs 5 times in the books of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, occurs once in Genesis, twice in Exodus, and twice in the book of Numbers, 5 times in the Torah. you have the name Ramses. And scholars agree that the city of Ramses that was built by Ramses the Great is almost certainly Ramses of the Bible. Linguistically, it's a good fit. Now, for a long, long time, it was thought that the site of Tanis, or San al-Hagar, was thought to be the location of Ramses, and with good cause. Here is Tanis, or Zoan of the Bible, or San al-Hagar in Arabic. Here you can see a Google Earth image of the site, and it's a very, very large site. You can see the modern-day village of San al-Hagar around it. There's a canal, but here is the archaeological site. The French have been working here ever since the 1920s, mostly in this area where the temples were found, and there's another temple over here. If you go to this site, you will understand why the French, for many, many years, thought that this was the site of Ramses. Because on the surface, they found many blocks of Ramses II, obelisks, statues, inscriptions. Here's a large statue. There's the head. It's over to the side. So many things from Ramesses, and many of the blocks mention the name of the city, Pyramisi. Here's a large obelisk, which I understand was recently removed and taken to your new capital. So it'll stand there instead of Pyramisi, where it stood for maybe 100 years, and then for the last 3,000 years at Tanis, and now it's moved to the new capital. So you can understand, with all this material from the city of Ramses, why the French for many, many years thought that this is the location of Ramesses. However, to the south, a little over 20 kilometers away, 20, 25 kilometers away, there's a small town called Kantir. And Kantir revealed few interesting remains on the surface, including these large feet of the statue of Ramses II. That's my daughter when she was studying archaeology. And you can see this is in the middle of a wheat field. And what's interesting is back in the 1950s, some of you may know the name Labib Habashi. Dr. Labib Habashi was a Coptic Christian working in the Antiquities Organization, and he was the first to actually suggest that here, not at Tanis, is the location of ancient Ramesses. He did so based on the broken remains that were found, and he reasoned, rightly, that the city had been abandoned and the blocks were taken north to Tanis and used to build a new city. And broken pieces were left behind. And that's what you see, some of the broken remains. And it turns out now he was right. Everybody, it took the French at least another 30 years to get over it, but they finally did. And everyone now agrees that Kantir is Pyramisi. Here are some of the more recent discoveries. Germans have been working at Pyramisi now for over 30 years. They did extensive magnetometer survey like I showed you earlier. There are the feet. This is Dr. Edgar Pusch, maybe 20, 25 years ago. And here he is, and with me, we were lecturing together in Australia last year, and we were in Adelaide, but we had a very nice lecture tour together, so I learned much more about his work, and now he has passed on his work to a young colleague who is continuing to direct excavations at Pyramisi. From the magnetometry survey they did, they have a broad outline of the city that is maybe up to 10 square kilometers, very large city, and perhaps the largest city in the world at that time. And you can see the modern-day town of Kantir is in the middle, so much of this ancient city is under the modern city. Only outside of the city do you have all these buildings. So all these black lines you see are from the magnetometer. Now here is one area in which you can once again see a temple. You can see the entry to the temple, the big open court. as you go back into the holy place, gets smaller. And then on the outside, you see the mud brick storage facilities like we saw at the Ramesseum and so on. So here's a temple. It just awaits excavation. We know what it is. We know where it is. It just has to be excavated. This is one of the beautiful things about the magnetometer survey. If you want to find tombs, if you want to find administrative buildings, if you want to find temples, you can identify them and then start excavating, and you know exactly where the walls will be. Okay. Again, just a reminder, the temple surrounded by the mud brick storage at the Ramesseum is just like we have here, the temple, and then surrounded by the magazines like this. Okay. Now also, interesting discovery made at Kantir is the ancient stable where the horses were kept, the royal horse stables. And here you can see the plan of these stables. Here's the excavated portion of them. And they found many of these stones with holes where the rope would be tied from the neck of the animal while it's standing there to keep it from running away. And here's a reconstruction. And based on the number of spaces, Edgar Pusch believes they could have housed 360 horses in this stable. So when we think of Pharaoh sending his chariots after the Hebrews, 600 of his finest chariots, it could well be that half of those chariots came from this one stable alone. Now, we have established that Ramesses is a real place. We've established that there is a place called Pithom, probably Tel Retaba. We've established that there's a place called Sukkot or Cheku, which is at Tel Maskuta. And the destination that we will try to get the Israelites to is the name of the sea or the body of water they passed through. The name of the body of water in Hebrew, and here you see all the Bible references, the name of the body of water is Yam Suf. Yam, of course, means sea, and Suf means reeds. In Exodus chapter 2, we read about how the mother of Moses took the baby, made a basket, and then placed the basket with the baby in the water amongst the reeds. And that word reeds is our word suf. So there's no doubt as to what this means, that the mother placed the basket in the Nile waters by the reeds. However, we have all these references, both in Exodus, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and in many of the Psalms, that identify the name of the sea through which the Israelites passed as Yam Suf, which in English would be Reed Sea, not Red Sea. This is a we'll come back to that in a second. The Hebrew word suf, meaning reeds, actually comes from the Egyptian, one of the Egyptian words for reeds, chuf, Egyptian word chuf. So the linguistic connection of these two words goes all the way back into the 19th century. And here I give you a footnote to the Standard Egyptian Dictionary, the German one from 1931, that tells you that linguistically these two words are related. So the word reeds here, the reed of sea, is an Egyptian name for this body of water. And it means reeds. Now, the puzzle, of course, is why did the Greek translators, the Septuagint, translate this as Red Sea? They did not translate Reed Sea, but Red Sea. Now, for those of you who understand my English, you know that the difference between reed and red is one letter E. However, the difference from Hebrew to Greek is very complicated. So, suf is reed, but red in Hebrew is Edom, the Edomites. Edom is red. So clearly this is not a mistake for Edom. In Greek, the word red is eruthra, and that's what the Septuagint translates this as Erathra Thalassa, the Red Sea. So why did the Greek translators translate Reed Sea as Red Sea? We don't know. It's clearly they didn't translate it. It may be that they looked at a map of their day and they tried to understand the geography, and they imposed onto their translation an understanding of the geography. It's possible. We don't know for sure. Now, in my research over the years, I have identified all these different locations that people have suggested for the crossing of the sea. As close as up here, Lake Bardawil in North Sinai, Timsah Lake, or Balach Lake. There's Timsah Lake, the Bitter Lakes, the Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of Aqaba, the Central Gulf of Aqaba, and the Southern Gulf of Aqaba. All these you will find in the literature today as proposed crossings of the sea. Now, clearly, all of them cannot be right, and maybe none of them are right. But I think I can demonstrate quite clearly that none of these are right. When the Israelites finally get the permission of Pharaoh to leave, we're told which way they did not go. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the land of the Philistines, although it was near. For God said, lest they, and here's the key word, turn back when they see war and return to Egypt. The word turn back, shuv in Hebrew, is a word that's used a lot, especially in the prophets, for repent. So if I'm walking in a way that dishonors God, I'm sinning, and I repent, I turn around and I walk the other way. That's shuv. You turn around and you go back. Okay, so you're doing bad, you turn and you do good. Okay, that's how it's used. But here it has to do with you're going a certain direction on a road, you see something that scares you, you turn around and you head back. But it's the same idea. Now, we've seen this before, but we need to see it again. The way of the land of the Philistines is the route that leads across close to the Mediterranean from the border of Egypt all the way to Rafah in ancient times, Gaza, and on into Canaan. So we're explicitly told that they did not go that way. God did not lead them that way, although that was the closest way to leave Egypt. The alternative route is to suggest, because there are really two roads, two highways, if you will. Don't think highways like today, no asphalt roads, but two roads out of Egypt to go to the land of Canaan. One on the coast and one that lines up with the Wadi Tumilat, Ismailia, and then on and up to Beersheba and Hebron and so on. This was the route we mentioned already that the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, this is the route they would have traveled on quite a bit. Hagar traveled on this route, trying to go back to Egypt and so on. If you go to Karnak Temple today, you will see this wonderful wall on the outside of the main temple, and it contains a detailed picture of the Pharaoh Seti I, and it tells us about the names of the forts that begin at Egypt's border and go all the way over to Gaza. There are 10 forts that guard the road that the Bible calls the way of the land of the Philistines. So if you traveled this road, every so many kilometers, you'd come to another military fort. So you have the pictures of them, and this one was the frontier or the border town, and today it's located near Kantara Sharq, just east of the Suez Canal, maybe 10 kilometers. So there are two sets of buildings and water in between them with crocodiles. And this is a picture I showed you earlier of Seti bringing back prisoners from his campaign. Okay? So we have a fortress, we have body of water here, we have a different body of water here with fish, and then we have a series of forts. And I want to draw your attention to the first fort after this one. The name is called the Dwelling of the lion being a name for Pharaoh. And then the next fort is called the Migdal of Men-Ma'atre. Men-Ma'atre is the name of Seti I. So this is Seti I. These are the forts that either he built or had named after him, which was very common. You name the city or the fort after the reigning king. So these forts continue all the way till you reach Gaza. So that gives you an idea, I believe, why God did not lead them on this way. It was very dangerous, not only because you had military opposition, but we also know there were lakes, there were large bodies of water, all of which would be a problem to travel. Now, here is Tanis, which is no longer important to us, but Kantir Ramesses is. So if they're leaving from here, the idea was to go this way and leave to the Promised Land. Here is the archaeological site today called Tel Hebwa, and on it was discovered two very large forts. Here is the remains of one, discovered in the 1980s, and you can see the walls and the military towers sticking out. And a statue was discovered in 1999, which has the name of the fort, Charu or Tharu, is actually written on this statue, so we know the location. Now, if we look again at the drawings from that scene, we have two forts, one on either side of this body of water. And just over 1 kilometer from the one fort, my colleague Dr. Muhammad Abdul Maqsood discovered a second very large fort. And the distance from the inside of the wall to the outside of the tower is about 13 meters. Very large fort. You can see here's a temple inside the walls of this very large fort. Here are the mud brick storage magazines here and here that we've been talking about. So we can clearly see that this was a very dangerous area and why God did not lead the Israelites this way. Now, Numbers 33 contains a list of all the places Moses led the people, and we're told these are the stages of the people of Israel when they went out of the land of Egypt by their companies under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Moses wrote down their starting places, stage by command of the Lord, and these are their stages according to their starting places. They set out from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. On the day after Passover, the people of Israel went out triumphantly in the sight of the Egyptians. Both Numbers and the book of Exodus gives us an identical sequence of places that the Israelites camped at. In other words, Moses records every place where they camped, spent the night or more than one night. In fact, the word that's used in Hebrew is wayachan, chan, like tent, where you set up your chan, right? So wayachan. So each of these places, they camped, they set up their tents. So they begin at Ramses. Here's Exodus, here's Numbers, and they travel. The first place they stop is Sukkot. The second place they camped is Etam at the edge of the wilderness. Again, Etam at the edge of the wilderness, Exodus 13:20. And then something very strange happens. They're about to leave Egypt, and God says, shuv, turn back. Turn back and go in the direction of a place called Migdal by the sea, and that's where the great miracle will happen that I will perform to get you out of the country. So interesting, almost word for word, Numbers and Exodus agree on what happens.